None of us know where this is going. This is the percent of people who strongly agree that young people today will not be able to live better than their parents has risen from 18% in 2001 to almost a third of us in 2008. And then I thought this was interesting. The bottom chart shows that basically people making under $35,000 and people making over $150,000 have the same level of opinion where they say they're not really certain about what lies ahead in the nation's economy. So I thought one thing that was quite amazing was this story of Mark Cooper. Did anybody see this from the New York Times? This is a story of an executive who was managing about a $1.5 million budget and in Tempe, Arizona, and his wife had breast cancer, and he's now working as a janitor in order to protect his wife and to protect his family. And that's just one of the stories that exist in this sort of composite of challenge that our consumers are facing. And what I'd like to offer today is, I guess, one insight is I believe there's a fundamental reshifting in Maslow. If you go back to this famous chart and you think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, what I believe happened over the course of the last sort of 20 to 25 years was the run-up in wealth creation in the United States also created a run-up in marketing image. And what we did is we started to climb ourselves up this pyramid, and once safety and security and food and water and the basics were met, we started to really pursue more sort of leisure class activities, right? So we focused on just do it and think different and impossible is nothing and live unbuttoned. There were all these sort of careless, free, sort of anthematic focuses that we marketers put into the consumer's minds, and at the same time, the media did as well. Who wants to be a millionaire, right? America's Next Top Model. Two days ago, there was a melee at the America's Top Model casting call, which got me to question whether or not people are starting to reappraise the reality of some of these pursuits. But the point I'm trying to make here is that this was Maslow up until sort of 2007, and what I'm seeing in my data is a sliding down like lava out of Mount Maslow back to things that are a bit more real and a bit more genuine. And this is where your brands and your marketing come in. Because the top part of that triangle is also very isolated, right? That's about me. The nature of pyramids are basically, to be narrow at the top. That's more inward, more isolated. And so at the same time, a lot of the ways that I believe we were marketing to people in the way that consumers were thinking about themselves is they were marketing brands to discriminate and to be different and to be isolated. And in fact, it's really anti-modern. Because as we've just talked about with MySpace and we've talked about many of the other social media, it's much more modern to be social. And so as you move your way back down the pyramid to the things that are a little bit more real, it's a much more social place. And I think that's what we're starting to see in some of the marketing efforts that I'm going to share with you in just a moment. So Maslow upended. Underneath this, I believe that there has been a psychic shift in consumerism from our cultural loss of trust. We see that evident through many things. Selfishness and collusion. There was a really great intersection of social media and the attack on Wall Street. This was the report on John Thane's office furniture that was auctioned off on Craigslist. If anybody remembers this, John had a $36,000 toilet in a $1.2 million renovation of his office in the third quarter of last year. So selfishness and collusion is part of the trust epidemic. We have Bernie Madoff from the cover of New York Magazine 2 weeks ago. And at the New York Toy Fair 2 weeks ago, one of the more popular items was the Madoff doll that came complete with a sledgehammer that you could crack it. But seriously, as Americans, we are faced with this sort of awakening of the failure of protection, the failure of regulatory oversight. Whether it's Moody, Standard & Poor's, anything that has a letter in it, SEC, FDA, FDIC, those questions are really shaking us, whether it's peanuts, these types of things. The average consumer is starting to question the failure of regulatory oversight. And obviously, AIG has introduced us to the fact that the American taxpayer is now a shareholder. So this is another burden to think through as they start to contemplate their relationships with brands and with our marketing. This is my hometown, and it's Hayes as well. This happened 2 summers ago, but the concern over decaying infrastructure in Minneapolis. And then the lack of permanence. Is your brand going to be around there for you in the future? This leads me just real quickly to kind of talk about the thesis of my book. I worked with my partner Ed Labar in Brand Asset Valuator from Young & Rubicam, and what we found was this run-up in exceptional values that had been attributed to brands that were out of step with what the consumer was thinking. And we researched over 400,000 brands across sort of 13 years. And what we found were two kind of core things. One was that the value of brands had actually increased over 80% from the later part of the 70s up until today. So brand value became almost a third of the operating value of the average firm. And at the same time, we started to understand that the size of brands, when you thought of them as a sector, was massive and powerful. In fact, the 250 most valuable brands would be larger than the GDP of France. But at the same time, we said, well, that's Wall Street, but what about Main Street? What are they thinking about brands? And we found that brand esteem had been declining, brand awareness, perceptions of brand quality, and in fact, trust in brands had declined 50% in our study. And what we then found through the course of the last 6 months is that trust has gone down again 30% off that basis. And what's really interesting to me is I kind of started to think about trust, and I said, okay, let's go look at Brand Asset Valuator across 30 product and service categories, and let's understand what trust really means. And what the blue bar on the top tells us is that trust is the second highest attribute, imagery attribute in our study that consumers say they want in a brand, right after high quality. At the bottom is sensuous, so I think that that feels pretty accurate. So the average correlation, though, to differentiation is quite low. So trustworthy here is low. So what it was saying to us is that trust is desirable, but hadn't really been thought of. Perhaps because of Lean Six Sigma and because of this feeling of safety that we had as Americans, we didn't really need to trust our brands. And what I think is shaping is a new form and a return to some old-fashioned basic values, which is the inherent in trust. And we're going to talk about those in a second. Because what I see happening in the data is a trust virus infecting many other product and service categories. So yes, I would have expected to see finance and insurance drop in trust, but we're seeing delta drops in apparel and accessories, in food, in health and beauty, in retail, pharmaceutical, and even in movie and print media. So consumers are basically, I believe, stepping back and saying, I'm not going to hand over myself to you. You are going to have to earn your trust with me. You're going to have to define yourself in authentic terms. You're going to have to define yourself with empathy in order to have my respect. Interestingly, you know, most recently in the press conference that Obama gave with regard to his cabinet shakeups in his kind of problems, he said, I screwed up. And it's interesting that the consumer is kind of doing the same thing. This is from Time magazine when consumers rated the problems that were associated with the responsibility for the economy. They rated themselves 15th, above George Bush but below Dick Fuld. But I think the point there is I think consumers have understood that they've been part of the problem, and they're starting to kind of take back and solve their own solutions. So behavior has changed, and it has changed almost overnight. Savings rate has risen the past 5 consecutive months, while at the same time, spending dropped the largest decline in 62 years. It fell 3.7% between the third and fourth quarter last year. So basically what happened is consumers forced reappraisal of what they were doing. They took action, and they've moved ahead. So what I believe then is that we need to create competitive advantage. You need to be thinking in terms of this optimism. You need to be thinking that we will come out of this recession eventually, and that consumers have already moved from this anxiety into action, and you need to figure out how you're tracing with them, how you are working with them to help shape their future, because it's obviously going to shape yours. So what we have seen is sort of 4 new cultural values, 4 new consumer behaviors, and resulting management principles that you can use to kind of adopt as you think about this sort of post-crisis consumerism. The first focus is really on this concept of indestructible spirit. And what I mean by that is that as Americans, our optimism has basically been rocked by the fact that there's no safety net. And we realize now that we are settling in for a prolonged era of hardship and challenge. And at the same time, we're also seeing a strong movement in our data toward people acting to be more self-reliant, to be more resourceful, and to be more responsible. And underneath that, the strategy that we see emerging, one aspect, is this idea called durable living. And what this is about is necessarily sometimes selectively seeking quality to make things last. And so they're looking for higher quality products. They're also looking for benefits that may not be immediately perceived. So focus on warranties, focus on insulation, ways to protect and enhance existing assets. And also there's this focus on sort of reappraising brands overall. And I think the management principle that we could take away from